very good afternoon or very good morning, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are. As István mentioned, now without any break, we will continue with two presentations. So if I'm not mistaken, Benjamin de Cleen and Petra Bárd are with us. Hi, good afternoon. So now we will continue with two presentations, and after the presentations, of course, if we have time, then there's the possibility for a short Q&A. First, I would like to introduce Benjamin de Cleen, who is an associate professor at the VUB University Communication Studies Department, where he is the coordinator of the English Language Master Program on Journalism and Media. He is also the co-director of the ECHO Research Group and the International Chair of Desire, the Center for Democracy, Signification and Resistance, which is an international joint research group. His research mainly been focused on radical right rhetoric and on the discursive conceptualization of populism, nationalism, and conservatism. So not surprisingly, the title of his presentation is When Populism Meets Nationalism, Understanding the Limited and Specific Role of Populism. So Benjamin, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erik, for the kind introduction. I would like to share some slides, if that's okay, but I don't seem to have the rights at this moment.
Actually, we will make you, in this case, a host, and then you can share your screen.
Very good.
Give
Thanks
me
very
a
much.
moment. It's done.
Okay,
so now
that
you
looks
can
better.
Share your screen.
Okay, now how do I do this? Desktop one. I have all kinds of options.
Yeah, you can see a green button.
Yes. But now I see, I'm just not sure how to share one specific program. Microsoft PowerPoint.
We will see all of your screen, so.
Okay, let me allow Zoom to share your screen. Okay, Zoom. Okay, wait a second. Okay, Zoom. Yeah, I have a new computer where Zoom didn't have the rights yet, it seemed. Can I share my screen? Okay, we'll try again. Share. Is it sharing now?
Yeah, perfect.
Very good. So good afternoon, everyone around the world and in Hungary, which is also still part of the world. Thank you very much, Erik, for the introduction. Thank you very much, István, for inviting me. Today's conference is, of course, very ambitious in its aim to grasp and tackle the future challenges for democracy, from climate change to anti-liberal populist forces and so on. So it's a very ambitious conference with very interesting contributions so far. My aim will be quite modest today. What I want to try to do is provide a bit of a conceptual framework to an extent about the role and the relations between populism and nationalism, especially in the case of the far right. But I think these definitions will also be relevant to other cases as well. So I'm not going to speak so much about the dangers of the radical right or what to do against them. But I want to give a bit of a conceptual framework that allows us at least to understand what we're dealing with. And to discuss a bit what is the specific role of populism in this problématique, as they would say in French. This is, of course, in the context of a political debate where the notion of populism is very often used as a sort of major danger to democracy, which it, of course, is in some cases. But I have the feeling that this term has been seriously inflated, and that we speak about it way too much, and that we attribute too much importance to populism per se as a threat to democracy, and so on and so on. So this is what I want to talk about today. Let me see if I can move my slides. Yes. So I will quickly make a conceptual distinction between populism and nationalism. This is what I will start from. I then will go very briefly into how we can study the combination between them. And I will try to illustrate this with the radical right. So there is a lot of confusion and overlap between populism and nationalism. When we look at scientific, academic debate, it's a little bit better now, but when we look at journalism and political debate, there are a lot of confusions and overlaps. For example, a title from The Independent would say something like authoritarian populism behind Donald Trump's victory and Brexit becoming driving force in European politics, with a subtitle that YouGov research finds anti-immigrant ideology could be the political phenomenon of the next decade. This is a very typical example of the rather, I think, extreme conceptual imprecision that you get in a lot of these debates. Everything means the same, basically. Authoritarianism is populism, is anti-immigration ideology. Of course, these thinkings can be combined in practice, but I don't think it's very helpful to throw them all in one basket and look at them as if they were all the same. This is normatively not very helpful, but also analytically, I don't think you can do much with something like a title like this. What does this actually mean? So this is what I'm going against here. This is what I'm trying to do. So the problem is, of course, that when you define populism as being anti-immigration ideology or authoritarianism or both, is that you cannot cover all kinds of populism, because some populisms are not anti-immigration at all. Some are not authoritarian, some authoritarianisms are not populist, some radical right is not populist, etc. These things are different. The one problem is you cannot cover all kinds of populism. Secondly, you cannot capture the specificity of populism. So populism does play a significant role in contemporary political reality, quite obviously, but it plays a specific role because it's something specific. It's a specific dimension of the politics of Orbán, Trump, or Podemos in Spain, or I don't know what. Populism does play a role there, but it's a specific role. And this is what populism needs to capture, and nothing more than that. So in academic work, this conceptual imprecision is now, at least to a large extent, solved, I think, by now. There is still some confusion left, of course, but systematic attention for the relation between populism and nationalism, which I think is crucial to understanding our contemporary political reality, is still quite rare. So this is what I'm trying to do something with here. So this is a table, a moderately well layouted table from a paper I co-wrote with Yanis Stavrakakis about the differences between populism and nationalism. And as you can see, we start from the idea that both populism and nationalism, and this is one of the roots of their confusion, of course, speak about the people or claim to represent the people in different languages. Das Volk, the people, le peuple. In many languages, this is the same term that is used. But our contention is, of course, that these terms mean something else in these two types of discourses. So in nationalism, we're dealing with the people as nation, where people are appealed to as a member of the nation. Let's say Magyarok, for example. And this is a national appeal to people. So people as members of the nation, which means that they are distinguished from non-members of the nation, for example, migrants, or other nations, for example, Romanians. Populism does something very else because it appeals to the people as an underdog. And so it appeals to people as members of the ordinary people. And of course, the ordinary people are not, in the first place, distinguished from other nations, but they are distinguished from the establishment or the elite, be it the national elite or the EU elite or whatever, but the elite. So this is what we're dealing with here. And if you try to express this in a sort of, let's say, architectonic or spatial way, if you try to visualize it, you will see that nationalism has a much more horizontal dimension of distinguishing between groups of people, largely based on territory, culture, language, and so on and so on. Whereas populism has a clearly vertical axis. Yeah, it's about hierarchy, power, or the absence of it. Yeah, so this is the basic distinction we made here. If you want to visualize this a bit more, you get something like this. This is quite a bad representation of how nationalism would look, but the idea is, of course, that the people as nation should coincide with the borders of the nation, and that they should be sovereign in that nation, which can be more or less exclusive, more or less inclusive. It's easier or less easy to become a member of the nation. The opposition to national outgroups is more or less hard. Let's say the first would kind of visualize radical right rhetorics. The second is a much more inclusionary nationalism. Also, depending on the kinds of nationalism, some nationalisms want an independent country. Others are okay with the sort of cultural autonomy within the country, etc., etc., etc. So all kinds of nuances. So this visualization does not capture that entirely, but you get my drift. The main thing here is that populism looks very different. So if populism is a political logic that revolves around the representation of the underdog against the elite and the claim to represent the people as underdog, it looks much more like this. If we start from the theory, for example, Ernesto Laclau, the idea would be that populists bring together what they call unsatisfied demands in society. Let's say the demand for more freedom of speech, the demand for religious freedom, lower bread price, I don't know, less cars, more cars, whatever. It can be anything really, it doesn't matter. The populists bring these together, not because these demands are necessarily compatible, but because they are all opposed to the elite that does not want to grant people those demands. That's the idea. So this would be populism, which is, as you can see, something very different than nationalism. Yeah. So that's the conceptual distinction. Erik, how long have I been going? I don't know.
Actually, according to the program, you have half an hour, but use as much as you want. And if it's a bit shorter, then we will have some space for the questions.
Okay, I still have some things to say, but please do stop me if I go over my time or if I'm getting boring. Yeah. So now, so this is the difference between the two, at least how I would see them. Now, the question is, of course, this conceptual distinction does not at all mean that in reality, these two things cannot be very closely related. I actually think they are very closely related in empirical reality. But the point is that to understand the connections between them in that empirical reality, we need to start from a clear conceptual distinction. That's the idea. Yeah. So the question becomes, how do we study that? So the question, very, very, very schematically put, it's not elite, it's elite. Something happened with my slide there. But so the question is, how do these two come together? And how can you study that? There's a number of things you can do. You can ask yourself, for example, how do the core signifiers of populism and nationalism relate to each other? Yeah, for example, how does the notion of the ordinary people in a certain political rhetoric relate to national identity, for example? Yeah, or how does the elite relate to national identity? Or who is part of the ordinary people and who is not? Are migrants part of the ordinary people? Yes or no? So these are all questions you can ask. This will be different on the left and the right, obviously. What respective role do populism and nationalism play? Are we dealing with a mainly nationalist politics that has some populist elements? Or are we dealing with a quite thoroughly populist politics where nationalism plays some kind of role? This is very different. Also, what kind of nationalism are we dealing with, of course? And so more visually put, you could ask yourself, how are these down, up, and in, out axes related to each other? Yeah. And then there, of course, there's also the question, what other aspects beyond populism and nationalism are we dealing with here? Conservatism, feminism, I don't know. So, but this is not something I will deal with today. But so this is the question. And this is something I want to illustrate a little bit by looking at the role of populism on the radical right, which is quite important. There's a number of examples here already. You see Marine Le Pen on the top in the 2017 election campaign, Au nom du peuple, in the name of the people. So my question is, of course, when Marine Le Pen says that she speaks au nom du peuple, in the name of the people, what does the people mean? My idea is that it means both the people as underdog and the people as nation, and that these are very closely related to each other. I will develop this idea in a bit more detail very soon. On the left, you see a picture of a Pegida demonstration, Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, where again, the people has both a nationalist and a much more populist meaning, and that they come together. Yeah? So this is what I'm saying here. They do really, really very often occur together, but, and this is the point, I think, to understand why it's so powerful, that combination, we need to look at it as a combination rather than extend our definition of populism to mean all of this. Yeah, that's the idea here. So Casmudo already said in 2007, or also before perhaps, that he prefers the term populist radical right over other options that would say right-wing populism, for example, because populist radical right stresses that the radical right is the core of the matter, and that populism is a version or a kind of radical right. Yeah, I quite agree with this. And so radical right nativism, especially, sometimes racism, is the core of the matter for the radical right, not populism. It's also this kind of exclusion that is the main democratic threat of the radical right, not their populism per se, but populism is, of course, very important to what they do, and it has made their nativism much more prominent and much more powerful than it would have been without that populism. Yeah. So this is what I would like to say here. Now, how can we see that nativism is the core of the matter and not populism? I think there are two main ways we can see this. One is by looking at the combination of populism and resistance to supranational politics, which you found very much, as discussed earlier today, for example, in the resistance to, in the demands for a Brexit, where you get a very strong combination of populism and resistance to supranational political bodies. I'm not going to discuss that in much detail. What I'm going to focus on now is the combination of populism and nativism or exclusionary nationalism, in some cases, racism. And my argument is that it is this nativism that is the core of the matter and not populism. Now, how do you see this? One way you see this is that when you look at who the radical right considers as the populist people, the people as an underdog, you notice that this is a subgroup of the nation, which means if you are not a member of the nation, you cannot be part of the ordinary people. So let's say people of migrant descent who work in the same factory earn exactly the same money as their neighbors, but are not white or not white enough or not the right kind of white, and or are from another country or have a different religion or wear different clothes or whatever, cannot be part of these people as underdog. They are just not part of that. So the people as underdog to the radical right is a sort of, to an extent, it's the white working class, but it's also broader than that. It all even includes people who are not really ordinary people in socioeconomic terms at all, but at least they are real Flemings, real Flemish people, or real Hungarians, or real whatever it is. That's one part, one thing you notice there. A second way you notice this, that nativism is the core and not populism, is that the people is presented as an underdog mainly through ethnic nationalist arguments. So what are the people suffering from? It's migration, globalization, or in the case of supranational politics, the colonization by the European elites, etc., etc. This is what the main problem for the ordinary people, according to the radical right, is multiculturalism, globalism, the insufficient nationalism, migration, ethnic diversity, and so on and so on and so on. And the main thing that is wrong with the elite is exactly that. It's a globalist elite. It's people are working together with Soros, or they are welcoming too many refugees, or whatever it is. The main problem with the elite is that they are pro-migration. If you look at see if I can go up here in my slides. Yes, if you look at the Frau Merkel here, is das Volk, for example, is a good example. So Frau Merkel, if you look at the photo of Frau Merkel, she's wearing a headscarf, which paints her as a friend of the Muslims, of course. And so this Frau Merkel, it's das Volk that is attacking Frau Merkel here. And das Volk is both a nationalist and a populist notion in this specific poster. Yeah. So instead of listening to the migrants, Frau Merkel should listen to the ordinary people. So what you get here through this combination of populism and nativism is the construction of two opposing blocks, where one is national and nationalist, but also down in terms of powerlessness. And one is multiculturalist or globalist and is the powerful up. So to represent this visually, you would get something like this, where the elite is together, is representing the interest of national outgroups rather than of their own people. Yeah, which is what the Frau Merkel here is das Volk clearly indicates. Frau Merkel as a sort of friend of the migrants rather than a friend of the real Germans, of the ordinary Germans. So this is the kind of combination you get here. This combination is very, very, very powerful, I think, and really key to understanding the appeal of the radical right and also its effects. So let me just try to kind of conclude here. So I think that, and this is where I started, of course, labeling the radical right as just populist is really a mistake. It's analytically incorrect, and it's normatively very problematic as well. But populism is strategically important, and therefore we need to speak about it. So populism helps them, the radical right, to criticize and undermine the legitimacy of traditional politics in general. It also legitimizes their exclusionary nationalist project in the name of the ordinary people. So instead of being some kind of fringe group with extreme ideas, they become the voice of the ordinary people. Yeah. And they have done that more generally as well, I think, also on some socioeconomic matters, more and more presenting themselves as the party of the people. This raises some important questions, I think. So first of all, what I try to say, of course, is that populism and nationalism are different things. They are very strongly related often, but they are not the same. So when we study the radical right, we need to discuss the radical right element first and foremost, and also the populist element, but we should never speak of populism alone because that doesn't mean enough. We can never capture it entirely. But it does have major strategic importance. And these are a number of questions that I would like to end with, where I have the impression that the radical right's claim to represent ordinary people is quite broadly accepted by much of the political spectrum, actually. Which we see in the fact that when political actors across the political spectrum speak about ordinary people, they are almost always speaking about a certain idea of white ordinary people, of a white working class sometimes. But this definition of the people as excluding migrants and also of the people as opposed to migrants is, I think, quite hegemonic across the board. So this raises a number of crucial questions. How has the labeling of the radical right as populist in public debate, how has this contributed to its legitimacy? Don't we legitimize their claim that they speak in the name of ordinary people by calling them populist? I think we are doing them a big favor by calling them that, actually. Why do we associate exclusionary nationalism and even racism with the ordinary people? Why does the category of ordinary people exclude ethnic minorities? Are these not ordinary people by now? Let's say a country like Belgium, we're dealing, I don't know how many generation Moroccan migrants. Why are these not just ordinary people? Why do they remain something outside of that? What role have other parties, center-right, but even center-left parties played in confirming this often even racist definition of what the ordinary people are and want? And what can progressive voices do to change the hegemonic meanings of the people? Which of course raises the question, does progressives, progressive groups or progressive voices attacking populism per se, is that the best way of, let's say, changing the hegemonic, the hegemonic status of the radical right? Is that the best way to go, or should we perhaps think of changing the definition of the people, or trying to change it and appealing to ordinary people in another way? These are open and very heavily debated questions, of course, but I think the combination of populism and nationalism raises this kind of questions that might also be quite uncomfortable for liberals and progressives as well. Erik, that would be it for my sake. I'm not sure how long I spoke or how much time we have left, but I hope we have some time left.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was 20 minutes, so just perfect timing.
And I will stop sharing also so that you can see me again.
Yeah, please. Thank you so much. And now my suggestion would be that before the presentation of Petra Bárd, let's continue with some questions from the audience. So I encourage everyone to use the Q&A, the chat box, or the raise your hand function, or just simply drop me a message if you have any question, and then we can continue with a short 10 minutes Q&A. And as I see, István Hegedűs from the Hungarian Europe Society has a question. So István first, and then some other questions coming. So István, please.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. I would like to ask you whether, following your presentation, is it easy to say that radical right-wing parties are always both nationalist and populist? That's my first question. My second is maybe more complicated. How do you put the problem of authoritarianism into this model? I mean, the Hungarian ruling party, I think, is both populist and nationalist, but also authoritarian. Can we make a difference to those populist, maybe nationalist parties, which are not authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, to make it even more complicated? Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you, István. Two very good questions. The first one, whether the radical right is always populist and nationalist, I don't think so. I think there have been historically radical right movements, and there still are today, that were explicitly elitist. If you look at, for example, the Flemish radical right, which I know best, if you look at the early party, let's say the first bit more than half a decade, and they slowly moved to a more populist positioning, but they saw themselves as a sort of aristocratic elite that spoke in the name of the Flemish people, because the Flemish people were too stupid to speak for themselves. This is almost literally what they said. They were anti-democratic explicitly. They spoke of the disease of parliamentarism, this kind of stuff, you know, and they saw themselves as a sort of nationalist vanguard that was smarter than everybody else. So they clearly were not populist. They weren't. And then they slowly moved towards a more populist position. And partly, and this is, I mean, this is a hypothesis I have, I would have to research it properly, but my feeling is that as they started to get more votes, they almost automatically started to speak more and more as if they were the voice of the people. And to an extent, I think the way their opponents responded to them, because they saw the success of the radical right as a proof of the gap between the people and the elite. And my feeling is that the commentators commenting on their election victories started to speak about this gap between the people and the elite even before the radical right in Flanders actually did. But this is just a hypothesis. I need to check whether this is historically correct. But so, yes, there can be radical right that is not populist, I think, absolutely. The second question is a lot more complicated, a lot less straightforward. If you look at Fidesz, it is populist in some moments. It is clearly authoritarian in probably most moments. It's clearly also nationalist in many moments. My feeling there is often when people speak about Fidesz as populist, no, let's say, if we have as many words as we want to label them, then populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism should all be there. But if we have a newspaper article title and we have one word to choose from, that word should not be populist. I think this is missing the point. I think authoritarian or anti-democratic or kleptocratic or I don't know what are more important terms, actually. And I have the feeling that addressing Fidesz as first and foremost populist is really quite unhelpful because it is also not always populist. It is populist in certain moments, less so in other moments. And I think it captures a certain dimension of what Fidesz does in certain moments, but it certainly doesn't capture everything, and it doesn't capture some of the central aspects of it, which are much more about power grabbing and state capture and kleptocratic politics than it is about representing the ordinary people. That would be my, let's say, fail outsider, half outsider, or largely outsider, but slightly a little bit insider position, but something like this. I don't know enough about it to give a very sensible answer, but this would be my feeling based on what I do know.
Thank you so much. As you may probably know, this conference is the final conference of a webinar series, what the Hungarian Europe Society organized during the last year. And it's a great pleasure for us to see some of our previous speakers participating during this conference. And one of them, Rafal Fabianovic, who was a former speaker, has a question now. So Rafal, please.
Thank you, Benjamin, for the very insightful presentation. I agree that the term populism is often mixed up with nationalism or used as a synonym, and we should definitely make differences. Where I see a bit of a problem in this debate is that I see a new wave of scientists protecting the term of populism, and they try to label it kind of like as something neutral. And I fundamentally have a problem by seeing populism somehow as also like a neutral term, because in itself it's kind of loaded with specific values. And where I have a most problematic reference to is how, and maybe the question to you here, how do you see the connection to science? Because from what I see often is that populists use untruths or not like unscientific information which might be popular. So for example, around climate change, there is like a bunch of misinformation, disinformation, if you want to use it. And we somehow live in the age of disinformation. And this disinformation goes hand in hand often with populism. And I cannot separate it as a kind of like a neutral term. I hope you can grasp it, and maybe you can answer my question. How do you see, as an expert of populism, the connection between science and populism? Bit away of nationalism, because I think you explained it already quite well.
It's a very good question, Rafa. Thank you very much. I was asked here to give the host back to Erik, but I don't know how to give the host back to Erik.
Yeah, actually, I hope that I'm not an authoritarian personality, but if it's possible, then please make me host once again before you are leaving, because then this is how I can help.
No, exactly. I would happily do it now if someone tells me what to do.
You can see the participants button below, and if you click on that, you will see all the participants, and when you click on the name, make host, and then make host. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And now I would like to ask you to answer Rafa's question, if it's possible, in 2 minutes, because then
absolutely. Okay, Rafa, so very good question. So I hear you in terms of, I think you are right that there is often this relation between populists and disinformation and all kinds of, I mean, we've seen COVID happening, all of us, and we've seen how that went. What I don't think is that this is a necessary element of populism. And because I have so little time, let me try to give a counter example. What would happen if a green leader in some European country or elsewhere stood up and really designed a powerful populist strategy that opposes the ordinary people against the climate changing, polluting, environmentally unfriendly elite? And part of this populist movement, for example, would also involve scientists and climate scientists who attack the elite for its disavowal and its inability to tackle climate change. So I think this is theoretically possible. Let's hope at some point it happens. But I don't think necessarily that populism has to be unscientific or against science necessarily. Often it is, but I don't think this is necessary per se. I think if you have a certain movement that speaks in the name of ordinary people, it could also attack the elite, for example, for lying about the climate change. So I think you could also turn this around in some cases.
Maybe just a short follow-up. I agree with you. For example, I was always a fan of Barack Obama, but he per se was also a populist, if you were to see like that. So it's not only the right-wing radical parties, it's also like in moderate circles. And I would say he was a moderate liberal politician, president. But still, I have the feeling, maybe it's subjective, that usually, like if we want to frame it somehow, the bad guys are more often using this populist mechanism for manipulation. So I have rather the feeling, but maybe it's not scientific, that like constructive politicians are not that often using this kind of toolkit. So this kind of toolkit is rather like coined or used by maybe like a different specific sort animal of politician. And this is where my worry is, and where I have a slight problem with if someone is trying to portraying the term of populist as neutral. But I agree with your point, like just in a scientific debate, like on a philosophical level, I completely agree that the term is completely neutral. It's just like popular opinion.
Okay. Erik, do I have the time to respond to this, or should I not respond?
Yeah, shortly, please.
Very short. So yes, I do also, I share your worry that often it is the wrong kind of people using the toolkit, to use your words. But there are also cases where I think some of us at least would be much more comfortable. Let's say Bernie Sanders' campaign for the presidential candidacy, for example, was very, very clearly populist. If you look at the campaign videos he made, it was all about the ordinary people versus the 1% and so on and so on. And I don't think that went hand in hand with so much lying about the climate or et cetera, et cetera. So there are, but I do agree with you that certainly in a European context, it's often not the most suitable people, in our opinions at least. I guess we share those opinions to an extent, using that toolkit. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Actually, István asked one sentence, and after one sentence, I will unmute you. So István, just really one sentence.
Yeah, Jan Werner Müller will speak in the afternoon about similar issues, and he argues that populism is only populism in case a populist politician or party declares that only he or his party is the representative of the people. So a sort of exclusionary character of populism is also needed. And in that case, not everybody who criticizes the elite can be called populist. That's the 1 or 1.5 sentence. Thank you.
Should I respond to that? I mean, I obviously don't agree with Jan Werner Müller. I think that his book had, in that sense, some very serious problems that I don't have time to expand on here today. But it's sort of, he started from the notion that populism is a curse word and it's an insult and it's something very problematic. And therefore, all the populists who are not problematic, including the party who came up with the term populism, the American People's Party, they are not really populists because they are not problematic. And so I find that in that sense, not the most productive definition in that sense. So I would disagree, not I wouldn't disagree with everything he says, obviously, but I would disagree with this definition of populism as being necessarily anti-pluralist and so on and so on. I don't think, is Bernie Sanders anti-pluralist? Maybe Jan Werner Müller would say, no, he isn't, but therefore he's not a populist. Whereas my conclusion would be the opposite. No, he isn't. Therefore, populism is not per definition anti-pluralist. This is basically a choice you make in terms of what you want to do with the definition. Is it a neutral analytical category that you try to use in that way, or is it a political normative category that you apply in that way? I think this is, to an extent, both are perhaps legitimate, but they are very clearly different choices, I think.
Thank you so much. Now we have to go on because we will run out of time, and I'm pretty sure that we will continue with another very controversial topic, which is the rule of law. But before the presentation, I would encourage you that, because in the chat box I've seen some comments, some remarks, and some of these remarks refer to some papers, some researches, some documents. So if you can share a link or a PDF or something, we are more than happy to share with the participants, obviously, and we can publish all of these papers and research documents on the webpage of the Hungarian Europe Society. Thank you. And now let's continue with Petra Bárd, who is a researcher at the Central European University's Legal Studies Department and the research affiliate at the CU Democracy Institute, and at the same time an associate professor at Eötvös Loránd University, Faculty of Law, Department of Criminology, and last but not at least, a member of the Hungarian Europe Society and a very good friend of us. She is a regular author of studies commissioned by the EU institutions on various subjects, such as the rule of law, minorities, disinformation and propaganda, media pluralism, hate crimes, and victims' rights. Currently, she participates at the Horizon 2020 Reconnect Consortium, and in the academic year 2021-2022, she's a Fernand Braudel Fellow at the European University Institute, Florence, Italy, from where she connects to us now. And the title of Petra's presentation is The Future of the Rule of Law and Its Current Challenges in Hungary. So Petra, the virtual floor is yours, and all in all, you have 30 minutes. If your presentation is a bit shorter, then just as in the case of Benjamin, then we will have time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Erik, for the kind introduction, and thank you István and Erik for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And Erik, you rightly mentioned I'm a proud member of the Hungarian Europe Society for 19 years. I just checked before I logged in. And congratulations to this awesome conference that you put together. It's very, very impressive. And I'm really sorry I had to teach a morning class and I couldn't participate at this entire event. Now, the topic that I was assigned to me, that corresponds also to my research topic, is the rule of law. The rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights and other values that European integration is based on, and how the current Hungarian trends contradict it and what consequences there are for the European project. So at the beginning, I would like to say a few words about the value system in the European Union. Then I would like to address the question why EU institutions haven't sufficiently responded to rule of law decline in Hungary. And finally, I would like to present some of the tools that the EU has available in order to counteract rule of law decline. So the values are enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union at the very basic basis of the Lisbon Treaty, which is kind of the constitutional foundation of European integration. And indeed, a number of values are listed there, but the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights, they have an overarching quality here, and also they are interconnected. So these are the values that capture the very essence of Europe as a peace project and as a project based on solidarity, humanity, tolerance, and pluralism. Now, when I say that these values, this trio of values that I mentioned at the beginning are interconnected, what I have in mind is that the rule of law without democracy is really a contradiction. It doesn't really make sense. Democracy with the rule of law at the same time, it may easily turn into the dictatorship of the majority. And these are also interconnected with fundamental rights. Just think about the dictatorship of the majority in this regard of minority rights, so in a way, human rights. But take another example, for example, the right to freedom of expression. Without the active side of freedom of expression, the right to criticize the government, or without the passive side of freedom of expression, the right to access to information, you cannot meaningfully participate in a deliberative democracy. You cannot make informed choices during elections. You cannot meaningfully participate in public debates if you are not in the possession of knowledge about the facts. Now, even though Article 2 values had been taken for granted for some time, a solid decline started a decade ago in Hungary, and other member states are now seemingly following suit. So currently, the EU is harboring member states that are not constitutional democracies anymore. And this is not just me saying that, but if you look at the various indices and indicators, you will see that according to varieties of democracy, Hungary is simply not a democracy any longer. Freedom House stopped putting Hungary among the free countries. It put Hungary in the cluster of partly free countries. But if you look at other indices, such as the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index or the Bertelsmann Stiftung Transformation Index, you will see that some member states are not doing well, quite to the contrary, and the most heavy decline in the EU-EFTA North America region was traced in 2020 in Hungary, which reached its laws, whether you are looking at the constraints on governmental powers, open government, fundamental rights, regulatory environment, civil justice, or the rule of law in general. So all in all, the European Union currently harbors member states, including Hungary, and I was asked to focus on that, but also Poland for that matter, that could not join the European project were they to apply today. Now, of course, no state is immune from individual violations of the rule of law or fundamental rights. But I would like to distinguish between the sporadic instances of rule of law violations from systemic decline, such as decline in Hungary and more recently Poland. So here I like to quote Cleen and Laurent Pesch, who are also recurring speakers at Hungarian Europe Society events, who say that in a rule of law decline state, elected public authorities deliberately implement governmental blueprints which aim to systematically weaken, annihilate, and capture institutions and procedures that are supposed to be checks on the government. Now, here is the question for all of us. How come that the European Union acted rather late and rather in a weak manner vis-a-vis Hungary, even though rule of law decline is going on for a decade now? Of course, you may argue that the European Union wasn't prepared for what was coming because it always regarded democracy and the transition to democracy as a one-way road. But after 10 years, I think you may legitimately ask the question why no intervention is happening, or a relatively weak intervention and late intervention. Interestingly, I talked about this topic a week ago and at an event under Chatham House rules, so I cannot tell you who my co-speaker was, but it was a person from the Commission, and he said, we are very well aware of what is going on in Hungary, so trust us, the Hungarian government cannot cheat us anymore. But if this is the case, then it gives a very dark picture of European institutions and their inaction. So I would like to give the benefit of the doubt to European institutions and just say that it's difficult to trace what is happening in Hungary and other countries because of a phenomenon that Professor András Sajó calls ruling by cheating in his most recent book with the same title. So what he says is that in a liberal democracy, or as he puts it, in a plebiscitarian leader democracy, or as Max Weber put it, in a Führerdemokratie, which has a very bad connotation, of course, for European listeners, the leader will do everything to conceal its true authoritarian tendencies. So there is a theory of cheating in its constitutional law, whether there are straightforward lies, deceit, fraud, or tricks. Just to recall, when the Hungarian fundamental law was adopted, which is highly controversial, remember that the Hungarian government sent a deliberately wrong English translation to Brussels, which was much more Europe-friendly than the actual Hungarian version. So sometimes the lies are very straightforward, sometimes the legal tricks are more sophisticated. In any case, these systems never openly challenge the rule of law. They engage in systemic cheating, pretending to satisfy the requirements of the rule of law by following specific rules that seem to be applicable, but they disregard the relevant standards or principles of the rule of law. So in a way, a regime that cheats in its use of the rule of law breaches the promise of truth or authenticity that the underlying norms of the game will be respected. Now, cheating can be observed with regard to all European values, but now I singled out the rule of law for you and fundamental rights. So relying on this theory of cheating, every step in the deconstruction of the rule of law has a veneer of legality. So instead of admitting of what is actually happening, namely changing laws and changing institutions and procedures with the sole aim of retaining power and money for that matter, illiberal governments make efforts to mix legality with the rule of law, and they argue that everything that they do is legal. Now, showing these veiled attempts to destroy the rule of law, the systems are characterized in the literature by oxymorons. Oxymorons such as, for example, constitutional pluralism or abusive constitutionalism. Now, these oxymorons illustrate that the rule of law is just a semblance. In these systems, the law does not serve as an opposition of arbitrary power, or as Martin Krieger says, they are not there to tame power. The Constitutional Court is compromised, the most experienced and most independent judges are removed from the system, the ombudsman system as we knew it ceases to exist, there are constant attacks against NGOs, the space for civil society is shrinking, there are attacks on academic freedom, vulnerable minorities are regularly targeted by the government in a systemic way, and interestingly, even the thinnest understanding of the rule of law is not respected. According to the thinnest understanding of the rule of law, a system is still based on the rule of law if the government can be changed. However, according to international observers, the most recent or the latest parliamentary elections and the parliamentary elections before were still free, but they were not fair anymore for a variety of reasons, starting from the capture of the media to the distorted election laws. Now, the same thing can be observed with regard to human rights. Again, no country after the Second World War in Europe would openly, deliberately just confess that it is violating human rights in a systemic manner. So again, these attempts are disguised. There are various legal tools to wield these attempts. One tool is just to frame everything in the rights language. For example, we need certain limitations of fundamental rights in the name of security, but security is not formulated as a state aim, rather it is formulated as a right, the right to security. So we don't have the traditional test to limit a certain fundamental right, but we have a balance of rights between liberty and security. What is more, there's a constant emergency, like in Hungary, since 2015, there's a constant emergency due to the alleged migration crisis. Then there was another quasi-emergency because of the pandemic, which is now over, but still the migration crisis is continuously there, and even the health crisis is coming back. So in these times of emergency, of course, according to the government, we need a different allocation of liberty and security than in ordinary times. So you just have to live with more severe violations of fundamental rights. Or there is another method which just simply depicts certain human rights violations as if they were happening in the name of the rights of others. Think about the homophobic law that has recently been adopted, which is allegedly adopted in the name of children's rights in order to protect them, which just equals pedophilia with that of minority sexual orientation. Now, human rights violations, again, happen all over the world, you may argue, but my response to that is that the Hungarian case is unique, and it's unique for at least 3 reasons. First of all, the quantity and the quality of violations. So these are not just individual violations, but whole societal groups are being attacked, whether these are the LGBTI community, as I just said, or the homeless, or the poor, or those giving home birth. I mean, various segments of society are in its entirety attacked. Then there is a second characteristic, namely that these human rights violations are often just red herrings. They are just there in order to veil some, for the government, more important issues. For example, there is the issue with the Fudan University, a Chinese university, coming to Budapest and all the corruption, alleged corruption surrounding it. And in order to divert attention, a homophobic law is adopted, right? So sometimes these red herrings, they don't have direct consequences for the people. Think about the Prime Minister of Hungary toying with the idea of seceding from the European Convention on Human Rights and reintroducing the death penalty. It wasn't serious, but anyway, the EU reacted forcefully and immediately, and the idea was dropped, but no one was harmed. But in other cases, like the homophobic law, whole segments of society are harmed, they are harassed, and their rights are violated. And there's a third characteristic, which is closely interrelated with rule of law decline, and this is the fact that human rights violations are simply rubber stamped by captured institutions. Think about, for example, the life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Before a Strasbourg condemnation, the Constitutional Court had a chance to have a say on the matter, but the Constitutional Court refused to quash the law, and it resulted directly in a Strasbourg condemnation. When the government gave insufficient response to the Strasbourg condemnation, again, the Constitutional Court could have remedied the situation, but it refused to do so, and Hungary was condemned by the Strasbourg Court for a second time. So this is how value decline is interconnected at so many levels. Now, rule of law decline or fundamental rights decline for that matter in a member state is an EU matter. It's an EU matter for many reasons. Once members of the European Parliament or a government is not elected in a fair process, this will jeopardize the whole European decision-making mechanism. You will have MEPs sitting in the European Parliament that were not elected in a fair process. You will have governments negotiating matters that were not elected in a fair process. It will also put the European Union into a bad light at the international scene. It's supposed to play a pioneering role with regard to fundamental rights and the rule of law, but if it cannot take care of its own illiberals, then it will be legitimacy loss and face loss, if I may say so. Also, if the EU doesn't respond to rule of law violations, they might become contagious, meaning that states may just copy each other, and this is already happening. And as a lawyer, let me just say that certain legal concepts are based on the presumption that every member state is a state based on the rule of law, and everyone will get a fair trial by an independent judiciary. Now, if this is not the case, the whole European Union law as we know it will collapse. Someone, in order to have an investment-friendly environment, has to be certain that he or she or his company can win a case even against a national government if he goes to court. Or a member state judge must be sure that he can extradite a suspect to another country, because in this other member state, the suspect will get a fair trial by an independent judiciary. If this is not the case, the judge sitting in a democratic state will simply not extradite or surrender individuals to other member states. And this is the end of EU law. So this is absolutely existential for the European Union to react. And interestingly, the European Union has not reacted very forcefully for quite some time, even though I would argue that the EU has a full arsenal of tools to enforce its values enshrined in Article 2. There are many tools which are only there for monitoring or benchmarking, or which are just platforms for a dialogue, such as Article 7.1, which is frankly just a platform for a dialogue, or the EU Justice Scoreboard, or the Commission's annual rule of law report. These are not the procedures I have in mind. There are hardcore enforcement mechanisms, such as Article 7.2.3, so the sanctioning prong of Article 7. I understand it would need a reform in order to be effective, because it's very difficult to trigger it and for the procedure to come to an end, but there are some legal leeways out of this situation, and it could be invoked much more often and much more effectively, and not when the damage is already done, but there could be a threatening by Article 7.2.3 before. I would also argue that infringement procedures could be much more heavily used for rule of law violations. And the Commission could bundle cases that have a rule of law element in order to show the systemic nature of the rule of law decline. If this is not happening, the member states will interfere and they might start infringement procedures against each other, which is already, it's not yet happening, but at least some governments like the Dutch, the Finns are already toying with the idea of suing some other member states for not respecting the rule of law. Now, my suggestion for the Commission would be, if I can make a wish here, to take over these cases from the member states and pursue these cases in front of the Court of Justice. Now, I talk to people from the Commission and they are saying, no, that's a big no. First of all, the member states shouldn't tell us what to do. And second, the member states should also take responsibility in the enforcement of EU law. Now, I personally feel a little uncomfortable with that because it's not the member states who are supposed to be enforcing the treaties, it's the Commission. But at the same time, I can see where the Commission is coming from. They don't want to risk potentially losing a rule of law case because their concern is that it would be very unhelpful and it would have a counter effect if they lost a case in front of the Court of Justice. So they want to do this job by the member states and test in front of the Court of Justice whether the court is willing to condemn member states for rule of law violations. And finally, there is the new conditionality regulation, which could attach rule of law strings to the distribution of funds. But I think my time is up, so I would just like to summarize what my arguments were. Violations, and in particular systemic attacks on the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights in any of the member states, they do have direct consequences for the European project, for the European idea, and more specifically for EU law. I also argue that the EU has sufficient mechanism to tackle the problem, and the solution is not in the invention of even more and more tools, especially not tools that are based on dialogue and prolonging the procedures, but we should go for the sanctioning mechanism. Should existing mechanisms be used promptly, forcefully, and in a coordinated manner, I would argue that the EU could either put an end to backsliding, or if it's too much, it could at least slow down the destruction done by certain governments, or at the very minimum, it could put an end to the absurdity of financing the building of illiberal regimes in violation of EU values out of EU money. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your contribution to this debate that what can the EU and the EU institutions do. And I just would like to say that your written contribution, which will be published in our book, our edited volume after this conference, everybody can read in a more detailed way what you were talking about right now. So I encourage all of our participants to follow up and check in the upcoming months our webpage where this edited volume, this publication will be available. Thank you so much, Petra. And as we have started a bit later than according to the program, now I suggest to dedicate a few more minutes for the questions, if there's any. I see that Kim Lane-Chappelle from, I guess, from the United States would like to ask a question. So go ahead, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So first of all, I'm sorry to be late to this, but it's early in the United States, and it was really, really early when you guys all started. Petra, that was a fabulous presentation with a lot of novel elements. And I'm wondering, and you know, especially in this group, I'm interested in thinking about, you know, we've imagined that the EU is confronting a situation in which the Hungarian government will not change democratically. But we're also now faced with an upcoming election in which the opposition has a better chance than it's had in 10 years. So I'm wondering whether you could think aloud about what should the commission do if the opposition wins? Does that make a difference? In other words, the violations are still there. They've always existed. But if they start actually enforcing now, a lot of the pressure for the enforcement may fall on a new government that will also have its hands full. And I'm thinking particularly, I know you didn't talk at the end about the distribution of funds, but I'm looking at what's happening now in Hungary, where Orban has already started spending the recovery funds, even though they may not arrive. And if the commission goes forward with a recovery with one of these conditionality regulation enforcement actions against Hungary, the government will have spent the money they were expecting. And then also there'll be this procedure to cut all of the funds, and then the new government will be bankrupted, right? So I'm just wondering now whether we should switch gears as we think about what we're really urging the commission to do, to think about giving the new government a break, if in fact there can be a new government. And I wonder if you've given any thought to that.
Thank you, Kim. I'm
sorry, just because of the time concerns, I would suggest to collect another question, and then that will be the end because of the time frame. So now Andre has a question, and then Petra, you can react for both. Thank you.
Yes, hello everybody. I don't know if you hear me. Hopefully yes, because I'm on my smartphone.
Yes, please go ahead.
Good. I just wondering, very nice presentation, because I miss this kind of overview. And just wondering, sometimes I miss their kind of confusion, for me at least, EC, European Commission, and European Union, because it was like played like simultaneously sometimes, these tools and toolkits, because in my understandings, European Union is something which is more or less enforced by the nation states, nation governments, basically, exceptional European Parliament, which has weak powers. So, but the European Commission has unique role in that system, right? So I just not sure if it was clearly put separately, these issues. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for these questions, and special thanks for Kim for being here. I hope you were there at the beginning when I cited word by word your work. I think the Commission in this case could do huge harms to the new government if there was a new government, if the conditionality regulation was to be triggered. I mean, I think we are thinking in the same terms. Now the Fidesz government is spending all the money. If it has to be given back partially, you cannot violate legitimate expectations or rights of certain parties, so you have to finance this from the budget, which will just empty the budget of the new government, and this is just the road to well, unpopularity, to say the least. So I feel very, very ambivalent about the conditionality mechanism in case a new government steps in. Of course, this is always the problem when it comes to Strasbourg condemnation, Luxembourg condemnation, that the new government has to be responsible for the previous government's mischiefs or the one before. But here we are talking about huge sums of money that can really destroy the Hungarian economy. So I think this is a very dangerous path. So what I see more promising is actually your proposal going for systemic infringement procedures. And whenever the new government is trying to undo the harm to the constitutional structure, think about the constitutional court or think about the Supreme Court, the damage that is being done. And bear in mind, the constitutional court's capturing can probably not be tackled in a single topic infringement procedure. So you have to put everything together in order to point at the systemic nature and the interconnected nature of the damage done to the judiciary. So if the institutions, including the Court of Justice, but not exclusively the Court of Justice, could say that, yes, this is not a court in the meaning of EU law, or you would still have to satisfy certain requirements in order to make it a court. That would be much more helpful than going after the mischiefs of the Fidesz government via a new democratic government. So I see more force in infringement procedures. And bear in mind, I mean, I'm talking to the rest of the audience, this is not Article 7273. I don't see a huge potential there. It's really infringement procedures in a systemic manner. And answering the second question, thank you for that, Andre. I think it's not exclusively the Commission, and the Commission also stresses that it cannot exclusively solve the problem. It can solve the problem together with all the institutions. Now, the problem so far was not necessarily that the Commission was left alone. Rather, the most useful player in this exercise of enforcing Article 2 values was the Court of Justice so far. So in my view, it was the Court of Justice that was being left alone, that had to do the dirty job of saying the obvious, namely that some courts in the heart of Europe are just non-courts, not in relation to Hungary, but in relation to Poland. The Court of Justice said so. Or, for example, it had to deal with the situation of suspending mutual trust and mutual recognition among the member states. Now, I don't think that the court alone can bear political responsibility, for example, for the suspension of European Union laws that are based on mutual trust. Certain institutions during the legislative process adopted these laws, and they have to make sure that in case of a systemic rule of law violations, until these violations are still present, these laws can be suspended. So I think it should be an interplay between the various institutions, but certainly the Commission, which is ultimately the main responsible for the enforcement of the treaties and EU law in general, should play a leading role and a much more active role than currently. Thank you.
Petra, thank you for your presentation and thank you for being with us. Benjamin, thank you joining us today as well. And now I would suggest to take 13 minutes break. So let's continue at 4:10 because we are here in front of the computers for a while, so we will have the chance to take a little break, and sorry for the inconvenience for our next speakers. But then with a bit of 10 minutes late, we can continue. So I hope see all of you at 4:10. Thank you.